Let me begin with a spoonful of something you have almost surely seen before, and a mistake so common that most folks make it without ever knowing they have made it. Molasses. That dark, thick syrup sitting on a pantry shelf, or tucked behind the flour and sugar, where it may go untouched for months at a time. People look at it and think one of two things. They either think it is just another sweetener, more or less the same as any other syrup, or else they think it is some kind of old-fashioned health tonic, a miracle food from a simpler time that got forgotten by the modern world. And the plain truth is, both ideas miss what molasses really is. Not by a little either, by a good deal. That is the strange part of this dark syrup. It looks simple, it looks old, it looks familiar. It looks like the sort of thing there could not possibly be much to say about. But the moment you stop and ask what it actually is, not what people call it, not what the label suggests, not what some health article or old family saying has led you to assume, but what it really is, the whole thing opens up into something far more interesting than most people ever guess. For molasses is not merely sweet, it is not merely rustic, it is not merely healthy or sugar, and it is certainly not a magic food. It is something much more particular than that, and once you understand it, you will never look at the jar the same way again. So what is it exactly? Where does it come from? Why is it dark when sugar is white? Why do some folks swear by Blackstrap as if it were medicine in a bottle, while others hardly know what to do with it? Why does it show up in old recipes more often than in new ones? And why is it that this humble syrup, which so many people barely think about at all, carries within it a story of thrift, of misunderstanding, of trade, of hardship, and of the plain old human habit of throwing away the very part of a thing that held the deepest worth? If you have ever wondered whether molasses is just sugar by another name or something altogether different, stay with me, because most people do get it wrong, and I mean to tell it plainly. I come to this subject with a good deal of respect, because molasses belongs to that older kind of kitchen knowledge that used to be common and now too often is not. In an older home, especially one where baking was done regularly and little was wasted, molasses was no curiosity. It was a working ingredient, it was known, it was trusted, it was used with purpose. The people who kept it on hand did not usually speak of it in the grand language we use today around food. They were not trying to brand it or redeem it or build a whole health identity around it. They simply knew what it was, what it did, and why it was worth keeping. And that simple knowing is what so many people have lost. Before I go any further, let me say this. The truth of molasses is more interesting than the myths about it. That is usually the case with old foods. When modern people misunderstand a traditional ingredient, they tend to push it to one extreme or the other. They either dismiss it as backward and unimportant, or they crown it as a miracle and expect too much from it. But old kitchen things are seldom like that. They are usually more useful, more grounded, and more honest than the stories told about them. Molasses is one of those. If you understand it rightly, you do not need to exaggerate it. The truth is enough. Now let me tell you plainly what molasses really is, because the answer to that one question clears away almost every confusion that gathers around it. Molasses is what remains after sugar is made. That is the heart of it. It is the syrup left behind after sugarcane juice has been boiled and sugar crystals have been drawn out. In other words, molasses is not some separate sweet thing made alongside sugar, as if the two had nothing to do with one another. It is what is left when the sugar has been taken. The moment most folks hear that, they pause, because they have been thinking of molasses as a sweetener in its own right. And it is that, yes, but more fundamentally, it is the remainder from another process. It is the part that did not become white sugar. Let me walk that through carefully, because once you see it step by step, the mystery falls away. Sugar cane is harvested and crushed for its juice. That juice is sweet, but it is not the neat little white granules most people know from the bowl on the table. It is a liquid full of sugars and plant compounds, and minerals and color and flavor, and all the rest of what the cane carries in it. Then that juice is cooked down. Water is driven. As it thickens, sugar begins to form into crystals. Those crystals are separated out. Refined, dried, that is your sugar. But the whole liquid does not turn into those bright crystals. Part of it remains behind as a dark, heavy syrup. That syrup is molasses. And that one fact explains almost everything. It explains the color. It explains the flavor. It explains why molasses tastes deeper and stronger, and more bitter than white sugar. It explains why it carries a sort of heaviness and richness that plain sugar does not. White sugar is sweetness pared down and stripped clean. Molasses is what still holds the color, the edge, the weight, and much of the mineral content the crystal did not take with it. So when people say molasses is just another sweetener, they are missing the whole point. It is sweet, yes, but sweetness is not the main thing you are tasting. You are tasting what remained when sweetness was removed and refined. This is where a great many people begin to get it wrong. They imagine that because molasses is dark and less refined, and comes from an older process, it must be some wholly separate food from sugar. But it is tied to sugar at the root. It is born out of sugar making. Then there are other folks who hear that, and swing too far the other direction, and say, well then, if it comes from sugar, it is nothing but sugar, and there is no difference worth mentioning. That is wrong too. Molasses and white sugar come from the same source, yes, but they are not the same eating experience, not the same flavor, and not the same composition. If white sugar is the clean, bright note, molasses is the darker chord that stayed behind. And it grows more interesting than that, because not all molasses is the same. This is another place where confusion enters. Someone tastes a mild, sweeter molasses and thinks all molasses is like that. Someone else tastes Blackstrap and decides molasses as a whole is bitter, harsh, and nearly medicinal. But there are degrees to it, and the degree depends largely on how many times that syrup has gone through the boiling and extraction process. Earlier syrup is lighter, sweeter, and gentler. Later syrup is darker, heavier, less sweet, and more forceful in taste. By the time you reach Blackstrap, you are dealing with something far more intense than the milder molasses many people use in cookies or gingerbread. The first extraction leaves a syrup that is still quite sweet and comparatively mild. The second grows darker and more pronounced. The third, which is where Blackstrap comes in, is thick, strong, and no longer sweet in the easy, childish way people expect from syrup. That is why two people can talk about molasses and sound, as if they are describing two entirely different foods. In a sense, they are describing different points along the same path. One is talking about something warm and sweet and friendly in baking. The other is talking about something robust, bitter at the edges, and much less forgiving on the tongue. Both are speaking about molasses. They are just not speaking about the same stage of it. Now here is where the health confusion begins, and it is worth slowing down for, because your title is right. Most people do get it wrong. They hear that Blackstrap molasses has iron or calcium or potassium in it, and they leap from that straight into grand conclusions. Suddenly it is not merely a traditional pantry ingredient anymore. Suddenly it is painted as if it were medicine. And then someone else, hearing all that, pushes back and says the whole thing is nonsense, because it is still a sweetener, and people are romanticizing it. Once again, the truth sits in the middle, quieter and steadier than the arguments around it. Molasses does contain more of the original cane's mineral content than white sugar does. That much is plain enough. After all, the white crystals are the more stripped-down portion, while the dark syrup keeps more of what did not go into the refined sugar. So yes, molasses, especially Blackstrap, brings more to the table than white sugar in terms of flavor and mineral presence. But that does not make it a miracle. It does not transform it into a cure. It does not mean a person ought to treat it as though every spoonful were a tonic from heaven. It means only this: molasses is a less emptied-out thing than white sugar. It has more character in it, more bitterness, more depth, more residue of the plant, more of what refinement left behind. And to my mind, that is the very reason people either overpraise it or underappreciate it. We modern people do not do well with middle truths. We like our foods to be heroes or villains. We want them either perfectly clean or wonderfully rebellious, either bad for you or secretly medicinal, either modern and efficient or old and full of magic. But many traditional foods do not fit into that kind of talk. Molasses is one of them. It is an old ingredient with honest strengths and clear limits. It can be a useful part of a kitchen. It can add flavor no white sugar can add. It can contribute minerals white sugar does not bring, but it remains in the end a concentrated sweet substance from the making of sugar. To understand it rightly, you must hold both truths at once. And that, if you ask me, is part of the deeper lesson hiding in it. Molasses is a reminder that what gets left behind is not always worthless. Sometimes it is the place where the character remains. Sugar making sought the bright crystal. That was the prize. That was the polished part. That was the thing commerce could package neatly and move by the bagful. But in taking the crystal, much of the color and weight and complexity remained in the darker syrup. The refined thing became more uniform. The leftover kept more of the story. That is not a bad lesson for a person to sit with. The world is very quick to chase what looks pure and tidy and marketable. It is slower to notice what still holds the depth. Old kitchens knew something about that. They knew that what remained after the obvious prize had been removed might still be useful, nourishing, flavorful, even precious in its own homely way. A careful cook did not think only in terms of first cuts and finest appearances. A careful cook learned to value drippings, scraps, broth bones, whey, stale bread fit for pudding, fruit peels fit for preserves, and syrups that more glamorous trades might have treated as secondary. Thrift was not merely about being poor or fearful. It was a kind of sight, a way of seeing value where a careless eye saw leftovers. Molasses fits into that old way of seeing as naturally as anything could. Before I go on, let me pause at that point, because I think it is the hinge of the whole matter. If you understand molasses only as a sweetener, you miss the truth. If you understand it only as a health food, you miss the truth again. If you understand it as the dark remainder of sugar making, the part that kept more flavor, more color, more minerals, and more weight when the clean crystals were taken away, then suddenly everything else about it begins to make sense. Its taste makes sense. Its texture makes sense. Its reputation makes sense. Even the confusion around it makes sense. Once the root is clear, the rest falls into place. Now there is another part of the story that should be told honestly. Because molasses is not merely a kitchen story. It is a human story, and part of that story is dark. This syrup became deeply entangled in trade, power, and exploitation. Because molasses could be fermented and distilled into rum, it became economically important far beyond the kitchen. That demand tied it into a brutal commercial world that included the trafficking and enslavement of human beings. It is impossible to speak truthfully about the history of molasses without acknowledging that. Too many sweet things in human history have passed through bitter hands and cruel systems before they reached an ordinary table. Molasses was no exception. That matters because people often like old food stories only when they are quaint. They enjoy them when they can be reduced to warm kitchens and family recipes and simpler times. But the past was not simple. It held skill and wisdom, yes, but it also held violence, bondage, and injustice. Molasses moved through that world. It was taxed, traded, shipped, distilled, fought over, and made profitable within systems that did terrible harm. To remember that is not to spoil the story. It is to tell it honestly. A pantry ingredient can carry sorrow in its history, just as surely as it carries flavor in its jar. A grown person ought to be able to hold both facts at the same time. And even apart from that great moral darkness, molasses mattered enough to stir political anger and economic struggle. It was no trivial thing in the trade of earlier centuries. When governments taxed it, people felt it. When merchants moved it, fortunes were tied to it. When distillers sought it, whole networks of labor and transport bent around it. Think of that the next time you see a jar sitting half forgotten on a shelf. That thick syrup many people now treat as an afterthought once stood much closer to the center of trade and daily life than they would ever guess. It is a humbling thing to realize how often the common objects of our kitchens are shadows of larger histories. Now let me bring us back from the wider world to the plain uses of the pantry, because that is where most of us actually meet molasses. Why do people still keep it? Why do recipes call for it? Why has it held on, even after refined sugar became cheap and abundant? The simplest answer is that molasses does things sugar cannot do. It does not merely sweeten, it darkens, it deepens, it softens, it moistens. It brings a kind of gravity to baked goods. Put it into gingerbread, spice cake, baked beans, barbecue sauce, dense cookies, or brown bread, and you are not simply adding sweetness. You are adding character. You are adding a note that lingers lower and longer. It also helps hold moisture. That is one of the practical reasons old bakers valued it. A baked good made with molasses often stays softer and more tender than one sweetened only with white sugar. That matters in the kitchen far more than many modern discussions ever admit. People talk endlessly now about nutrients and labels and categories, but the old cook also cared about behavior. How does this ingredient bake? What does it do after 2 days on the counter? Does it keep a cookie from going hard? Does it give bread a fuller taste? Does it make a cake stay moist? Those practical truths kept ingredients in kitchens longer than any fashionable theory ever did. Molasses earned its place because it behaved well where it mattered. And here again, most people get it wrong, because they think understanding a food means understanding what category it belongs to. But the kitchen teaches a more useful lesson. To understand a thing truly, you must know what it is made from, what remains in it, what it does in a recipe, what kind is being used and what it is not. That last part matters a great deal. Molasses is not honey. It is not maple syrup. It is not just melted brown sugar. It is not raw cane juice in the form it first came from the plant. It is not a miracle supplement disguised as dessert. It is its own thing. The byproduct of sugar making, yes. The darker remainder, yes. But also a distinct ingredient with its own work to do. Let me tell you one more plain truth that clears up a good bit of confusion in an ordinary kitchen. Brown sugar, that soft, damp sugar so many people buy for baking, is in essence white sugar with molasses in it. That surprises some folks, but it should not once you understand the relationship between them. Refined sugar is separated out, and then molasses can be added back in to create brown sugar of varying depth and moisture. So if you ever find yourself out of brown sugar and holding only white sugar and a jar of molasses, you are not at the end of the road. Stir some molasses into the white sugar, work it through well, and you have made something very close to what the recipe was asking for. That is not a trick. It is simply knowing what the ingredient really is. And that, to my mind, is one of the pleasures of understanding food properly. Once you know what a thing is, it stops being mysterious in the wrong way and starts being useful in the right way. You are no longer at the mercy of labels and little marketing stories. You can reason from first principles. You can see why one syrup behaves differently from another. You can understand why Blackstrap tastes harsher than the lighter sort. You can understand why a cookie made with molasses stays soft. You can understand why the old recipes called for it, and why it remained beloved long after white sugar became common. Knowledge like that does not make the kitchen fancier. It makes it steadier. So let me gather the whole truth for you as plainly as I can. Molasses is the dark syrup left behind after sugar crystals are removed from boiled cane juice. That is what it is. It is related to sugar intimately, because it comes from the process of making sugar. But it is not the same as white sugar because it keeps more of the color, flavor, bitterness, and mineral residue that the refined crystal leaves behind. Lighter molasses is sweeter and milder. Darker molasses is heavier and stronger. Blackstrap is the most intense of the common types, and the least likely to be mistaken for simple syrup once you taste it. People get molasses wrong when they flatten it into one of two false stories. Either they say it is nothing but sugar under another name, or they say it is a kind of miracle health food. The truth is richer and more restrained than either of those. It is an old ingredient, a useful one, a flavorful one, a historically weighty one. A reminder that the part left behind may still hold great worth. That may be the reason it has lasted. Because once you taste it rightly and use it rightly, you begin to see that it offers something modern refinement often strips away. Not purity, not perfection, character, depth, a little edge, a little memory, a little of the old world still clinging to the spoon, and maybe that is why people remember it. Not because it is magical, but because it is honest. Tell me below, did you grow up with molasses in the house? Or was it the kind of thing you only ever saw in one recipe around the holidays? And when you think of it, do you think first of gingerbread, baked beans, brown bread, spice cookies, or something else entirely? I am always interested in the old family uses of these pantry ingredients, because that is where so much real knowledge lives. Not in the loudest claims, but in the steady habits that lasted long enough to be handed down. If your people used molasses in a way others may not know, I would love to hear it. And before you go, remember the central point, because it is the one most people miss. Molasses is not merely sweetness in a dark coat, and it is not a miracle hiding in a jar. It is the darker remainder of sugar making, the portion that kept more of the cane's weight and flavor when the white crystals were taken away. Once you know that, the whole thing becomes clearer. Its taste, its reputation, its place in old kitchens, even its myths. You understand why some praise it too highly, why others dismiss it too quickly, and why the truth deserves a better hearing than either camp gives it. The next time you see that thick dark syrup creep slowly off a spoon, you will know you are looking at more than a generic sweetener. You are looking at what remained after refinement did its work. You are looking at a pantry ingredient with depth, with practical use, with a history both useful and sorrowful, and with one old lesson tucked inside it that is still worth keeping. Do not be too quick to judge a thing by what was taken from it, or by the bright polished version that replaced it. Sometimes what is left behind still carries the greater part of the story. And sometimes, if you stop and look closely enough, that is where the real understanding begins.